Okay, thank you, everybody, and welcome to today's session at the Create Centre, hosted by the Schumacher Institute. And we're delighted to introduce Jean Boulton today to talk about her new book, The Tao of Complexity. So, Jean, introduce herself, and away we go.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jean.
Yes. Well, good afternoon, everybody online, and we've got a group of people in the room here as well. So this is a hybrid event, and thank you to Ian of the Schumacher Institute. I've put their link on the screen here as well. They've invited me and have been working in this field of systems thinking and global change in a variety of ways for many years. So I appreciate being invited. Thank you. What I want to do today is talk for about half an hour, and the book I've been giving a number of talks on the book, and I want to take a particular slant today, which is to do with really drilling down into what on earth is process complexity, what am I trying to say, and how does it fit with other complexities and systems thinking. Now, that's a tall order, but I want to position what I'm doing in relation to the whole kind of body of knowledge. Then I want to drill down in particular on the implications of what I'm doing and thinking about for global issues, and spend the next 15 minutes talking about those. So they're obviously both short, interesting, and very easy to talk about topics. So we'll see how that goes. After that, we'll have plenty of time for questions. And because there's quite a number of people in the room, we're asking you not to unmute and ask your questions, but to do it via chat. I know it's a bit onerous, but Amy and Melanie will moderate that, and we've also got people in the room who will be asking questions. So if you can kind of bear with us, and we'll finish at the latest by 5:30 and possibly earlier than that. So I hope that sounds okay, and we'll now see if I can change the slide. Which hasn't worked. It's not allowing me to change the slide, Ian, so I might need that one. No, we can't change the slides at the moment, and it's not changing on here either.
Okay. There we go.
How did you do that? Just clicked on there. Okay, right. It's all good technical stuff. So the book, this is a description of the book which I have here, and the book is called Making Sense and Making Waves in an Age of Turbulence. And the first part of the book is trying to look at things in an ontological sense, and in a sense of what are things really like? Is there something we can say about the nature of reality, including, if there is one, the nature of change? It's a kind of drilling down into what is, and I then go on to talk in the book about physics. I am a physicist by background, and how physics doesn't really paint a picture of a machine-like universal world. And I explain why I'm saying that. It isn't really demonstrating a deterministic universe, partly to put it simply, because you've got lots of different forces acting on messy stuff. And anyway, quantum mechanics messes it all up. So that's my kind of first summary of the first section of the book. I then want to introduce a processual view of complexity. And in the book, I talk about the cosmology of Taoism, and how I was so entranced by the fact that this theory, this processual worldview coming from the 5th century BC, gives you an almost identical view of the world as you get from complexity. In the book, I talk about the resonance with other perspectives and about knowing. And then the second half of the book is really saying, so what do you do then? At the level of the person, the organisation, and the global. So that's the book. And what I'm hoping to do today, and I have managed to change slides, so that's good, is to talk about processual view of complexity. And I want to, in particular, drill down into the global. So where am I starting from with complexity? I'm originally a physicist, and I came across through working at Cranfield School of Management, Professor Peter Allen, who used to work with Ilya Prigogine. So we were both of us theoretical physicists in a management department, which obviously makes lots of sense. And he'd worked with Prigogine and introduced me some 30 years ago now to complexity thinking. The work of Ilya Prigogine, for which he got the Nobel Prize, was looking at thermodynamics, which is the behavior of gases and liquids. But he was interested in open systems, that is, situations that can exchange energy and information with the wider world. And the thing that he talks about that really triggered his work was coming across the work of Henri Bergson, who wrote a book called Creative Evolution in 1907. And Bergson was saying, basically, evolution shows us that the world gets, the living world seems to get more and more complex and sophisticated, and more forms emerge. But physics doesn't seem to say this. Physics basically has two ideas. One of them is the machine view, that things carry on the same forever, or the other view is the equilibrium thermodynamics view, the thermodynamics of closed systems, which says things deteriorate eventually into featureless dust. So Bergson's question is saying, why does life seem to get more sophisticated and complex? Whereas what physics seems to tell us is either things stay the same or they disappear into featureless dust. And he got the Nobel Prize for this one word, if you want to put it that way, which was he was describing the behavior of open systems. And he showed that for open systems, order and patterning can emerge in situations. And the diagrams to the left of his head there are showing some work that was done by two Russians, Belousov and Zhabotinsky. Prigogine was originally Russian and was able to read their papers in the 1950s. And when they first came across these kind of funny swirls and patterns in these chemical situations, it was regarded as probably a mistake. But actually, it was the start of this kind of emerging new idea. Now, the reason for saying all that is that's my starting point, and where Prigogine was starting from is really starting from this idea of the micro. How do things at the bottom level of whatever, in this case it would be molecules, in our case it would be humans in social systems. But when we look at the interweaving and the interconnecting of things at this micro level, what can we understand from that? About that complexity. So my starting point for this is starting with the micro. It's not starting with abstractions or mathematics or simplifications. It's really trying to ask that question as a scientist, really. What can we understand if we really think about and look at this kind of micro interweaving of things? So I've been attracted to the work of the people I'm writing down there. Mary Parker Follett was one of the pragmatists who really thought through this kind of micro weaving at the level of the person. And it's a kind of what you would call a naturalistic metaphysics approach. In other words, all these people are trying to say, what does the world really do? What can I observe from being in it or doing experiments in it? It's not a theorizing about the world. It's kind of looking at what we can understand about the world through actually being there and looking at how things really change and stabilize. So what I've done in this piece of work, in introducing this idea of process, a processual view of complexity, which was very much in line with Prigogine. One of Prigogine's early books was called From Being to Becoming, and he was really emphasising this idea that in a sense things are always becoming. There's constant change. The paradox of constant change is sometimes that interweaving creates stability as much as it creates exchange. But the idea of microscopic variations interacting is kind of the underpinning. And what I talk about in part in the book is the difference between understanding the conditions that engender this complex, flexible social and ecologic situations, and distinguishing that from how do they behave, what are their characteristics. And what I'm arguing in the book is that the conditions for adaptive, balanced, complex social groups, or for even understanding or thinking about or examining complexity in social systems, is that they need to be open to the wider context. If things are closed, they in the end run out of energy and newness and tend to kind of become either rigid or closed down. Diversity in the sense of that there are many different actors in the system, and reflexive relationships. In other words, if I'm interacting with somebody in the room here, they're looking at me, I'm looking back at them, they say something, I say something back. We are mutually changed by that interaction. And if a third person joins in or glowers at us or something, then that is how those kind of interrelationships work. So if I want to try and give an example of what I'm really talking about with this sort of open, complex, reflexive understanding of complexity by taking the example of the family. So if you think about it, families are a small form of complex situation, of complex social groupings. And what happens in a family? Well, every family you go to is different, isn't it? They, if you go to tea with this family, that nobody sits down, it's all very chaotic, the kids are all yelling and it's, you're never quite sure whether you're going to get fed. I'm sure you all have friends like that. You go to somebody else's house and it's very, very organized, and the kids are very quiet and the food is on the table at time, and it's a very mannered kind of process. So those forms of relationship and the patterns of behaviour get established over time. They're shaped by history and context. They will change if grandma comes for tea, or if the dog dies, or if somebody goes to university, or whatever. But that kind of patterning of behaviour, and patterning in the sense of who's close to whom. If you did a kind of sculpt of the people in a family, who's close to whom, who's separate from whom, you would start to see some norming of behaviour, some kind of patterns that's sustained. However, and this is a good example of what can happen in social systems, some families are adaptive in the sense that, let's suppose the house burns down. That family has sufficient flexibility in its relationships that it can kind of cope with a disaster, or somebody dies, what happens then? Some families can reform because they've got multiple connections, and although there might be some norming of relationships in the family, there's enough flexibility and extended connections with more people that it will actually respond and be able to adapt to changing circumstances. Some families are very chaotic, and if something terrible happens, it's very difficult to pick up. They kind of remain chaotic. They're not able to kind of easily cope with change. And paradoxically, some families are so rigid that if something really disastrous happens, they're prone to unravel. They wouldn't be able to kind of pick up the bits. So this idea of thinking about the family as a simple social system shows you in this kind of thinking that, as I'm saying, families often display relatively stable patterns, but not always. They will display, it's still a complex system, but it will have times of relative stability. It will have times of rigidity, or some families will be rigid. It will have times of chaos, but it's still the same complex interwoven system underneath it. So that's kind of way of thinking about the way I think about process complexity. And one of the pieces of work that I did in developing the book was I found over quite an extended period of time that when I thought about it, galaxies are like that, that the kind of the complex interweaving of all the elements of stuff that go on in galaxies with all their different forces, and the way there are certain concentrations of things, and then another cloud of dust comes in. The galaxies, brains, communities, societies display these same characteristics. So there's something that we can kind of start to generalize about in some sense. And obviously, galaxies have got, that they're not thinking and having intentions and feelings, but there's something that we can understand about this kind of processual view of the complex world through thinking about families. So what I differentiate in the book is this, in developing this idea of process complexity. I'm talking about, as Prigogine did, that there's a sense in which things are always moving. So what gives the family its resilience is actually its ability to flex. And, if dad's late home from work, somebody else can make the tea, somebody else can take the dog out. If there's a big disaster, they can regroup. There's something about the paradox of this constant change, is that it is that creates these patterns of stability. So what I've moved on to say, having talked about these conditions of complexity, is that the characteristics of complex situations can be summarized by these words here: systemic, patterned, path-dependent, particular to context, punctuated, paradoxical, and emergent. Now, I could spend another 2 hours going through these different characteristics, and I'm not going to at the moment. You're welcome to ask me more questions about that. It's not very different from the book that Peter and I and Cliff Bowman wrote in 2015, but there's probably more emphasis on this kind of processual nature, and on the importance of, or the centrality of paradox, which is probably again a whole conversation in itself. So, by way of a quick introduction, I guess what I'm saying is that this micro, bottom-up, naturalistic view of complexity starts to show you how sometimes we could look at things organically, sometimes we could look at things as more rigid, but in a sense, the complexity is still there underneath. It may be more obvious sometimes and less obvious, but there's something that we're not into a different class of things. This is a sort of underlying view. And of course, sometimes things have exponential change or collapse. That is also part of this kind of view. Right, I can hear myself gabbling here, and time is ticking on. So very quickly, I want to say one of the really interesting parts of this book for me was to recognise this, as I said at the beginning, this kind of resonance, ontological resonance with other complexities, with other perspectives, rather. And I will say a little bit about the Tao Te Ching in a moment, but this idea of flow, of patterning, of paradox, of emergence is actually embedded in, even when I finally came across my PhD was in quantum physics, so I can just about understand Carlo Rovelli. When I came across his work, he has a very, underpinning it all is a relational worldview that is not dissimilar to what we're talking about here. So I really think this is interesting, because you don't have to, in some sense, I'm not saying here is process complexity, believe me. I'm saying, well, here's a view of process complexity. Isn't it interesting that these different people writing about completely different things in different ways, but working from an experience, these political writers have embedded themselves in regimes and thought about how did we get into this kind of locked in situation and how do we get ourselves out of it? This kind of experiential view in many ways starts to create a common perspective. So other than to say Taoism gives you a very similar view, I'm going to move on from that, because I wanted to really talk now for the next 10 minutes or so about what does all this mean, in my view, for tackling global issues. the core idea I want to talk about is this idea of path dependency, power, and lock-in. And it's really an important idea that comes out of complexity thinking. I think some people think that what complexity thinking is saying is that things self-regulate, that if you leave things alone, it'll all be all right because it'll all balance up and we can go home for tea. What we see, though, and what is certainly embedded in the theory, is path dependency. So the Taoist phrase is the path is made by walking, and what we're really saying is, depending on what you do, and depending where power lies in that, things can become stronger and lock out other things. So even the work on panicky and forests says that, you know, after time, even a forest as it matures will get more locked in. There will be certain patterns of relationships in the forest which will lock out newness. They will dominate the terrain. They energetically dominate it and they lock out other options. So there's something about power, and obviously it's a neutral power in a forest, but it isn't a neutral power in human systems. And it's a really important point that's being made, I think, here, that social systems don't naturally or necessarily balance. So as Stiglitz and other people have said, there is no invisible hand. It doesn't work that way. And of course, what we've been seeing since a kind of deregulation and a kind of movement to laissez-faire economics is an unbelievable, unspeakable rise in inequality. In the 1960s, the difference in the UK between managers and workers' pay was a factor of 6. Now it's a factor of over 150 on average. And coupled with unfettered growth, this kind of movement of the power in the hands of the few and the control of the economy means that actually, even if we are growing, and it's regarded as which is another issue, of course, but if it's regarded as something that's good for the economy, if it causes the removal of wealth from the economy by the rich, then we're not really any further forward in terms of wanting an equal society. And people talk of oligarchs building blocks of flats in New York that are used like Lego parts. You know, they're traded, they don't actually have people living in them, and that's an example of this kind of removal of wealth. So this idea of path dependency and an unregulated power locks in. Not only happens in kind of economics, but obviously happens in politics too. And these people who are writing about dictatorships and the rise, you know, I recommend A.K. Temel-Curran's book, The 7 Steps from Democracy to Dictatorship. You know, if we don't challenge early, if we let this kind of constellating of power continue, it becomes very hard later on to actually oppose. And there is a diminishment of dissenting voices. It's harder to process. The press are not so free. The judiciary becomes bought, in a sense, and captured. So this sounds like a huge political speech, but I am trying to show in the book that this idea of path dependency and the constellating of power is perfectly within the same theory as that which says, you know, if you want a nice, happy family, you know, have some diversity and balance. But it's about balance. And if we don't have balance and we set up situations where people can win and they're happy to win over others, then this theory explains beautifully how that happens. So it's important. So what do we do then? This is a huge topic. I'm not suggesting I have all the answers of this. The people, I found this a very interesting kind of area to actually think about and research. So what Adam Smith would have said about, you know, the marketplace is that we need attention to values. We need moral sentiments, as he called them. that if we are going to find balance, we do that by actively wanting to share, by thinking about the community as much as by ourselves. It is a value-based thing. There are people who write about economics who either say people are basically selfish, you've got to control them, or even people are basically good, so it'll be all right. Neither position is true. If you look at the sociobiology work, we all tend to have a potential to be selfish and a potential to be other-centered. But if we are going to a degree, have a balance of power, it's about how we act in that. If we just think it's up to us to be selfish, then that's what you won't get easily, as evidence shows. The system just doesn't generally balance itself up. There's also questions that are value-based questions that came, I'm now going to forget his name, but the person who gave the Reith lectures a few years ago, who was head of the Bank of England, a Canadian, I can't think of his name. Mark Carney was talking about, we also have to think about what economy is for. It's a thing that has a lot of agency. What do we want it to be for? How do we design it? Do we want it to be for the greater good, or do we want it to be for the winners? So these are big questions I'm asking, but they're important ones that come out of this kind of perspective. I think there are some really interesting, good examples coming up. So one of the things that I like, Mariana Mazzucato's work, she's doing some work with the Welsh government, and has done much work around the world. And she's talking about the importance of some leadership from the public sector, which she describes in terms of missions. So how can a government set a longer term agenda, think systemically and longer term about what society needs, and then encourage the private sector through funding and innovation and tax regimes and whatever, to actually move in that direction, so we are actually thinking about the future of society. We're not just leaving it to the market or leaving it to those people who have such power in terms of the corporate world. There's an example in Germany of the Mittelstand, of middle-sized companies who are privately owned, but kind of are an example of social capitalism, where this group of companies have been very resilient. They haven't grown hugely, but they've actually sustained many ups and downs over a long period of time, and they're embedded in their kind of societies and their environment. If you go to visit them, there are conversations about how they worry about the future employability of people's children, or they would never have 0 hours contracts because that wouldn't be fair. You end up finding there's a sort of natural conversation about the environment, the communities, that come out of a different way of running business. And the final point I want to make here, there's lots of points I could make, is Ian and I were talking about this earlier, is to do with governance. I went to a talk recently from an economist who was saying, well, we shouldn't expect the corporate sector to think about other than growth and profit. Why should we expect them to? But if we don't expect them to, how are we going to govern them? The large corporates have more power in the world than any other body by far. What are we going to do then if their whole agenda is just to extract wealth and put other people out of business and win? So we have to think about, what does governance mean in this kind of world? And it's not, I'm not going to stand here and say there are easy answers, but there is something about how do we all behave in that respect? I'm just being waved at because I'm running out of time. But I would really like to discuss, not just here, but I think, how do we as individuals, how do we as groups, what does global governance mean? If we don't, then we are merely in the hands of the private sector, which is there to make money. So, final slide. What can I do then? What can each of us do? And there's a lot, you could say a lot here. I think what I'm left with in terms of myself, and I guess in a sense talking and writing this book and talking this way is my sort of activism. If the future is not entirely knowable, then every action contributes towards the future. We are co-creating the future. So it's our actions, values, beliefs and intentions that enter and shape the future. So, for example, if we decide to lie in order to create an endpoint that seems important to us, what actually enters the system is the lie. So if we have political systems where lying is regarded as normal, then it's the lies that enter the system and create the culture and become normalized. We may never get to the end point. But the other thing that I think I want to say in terms of this, so what I'm saying is, I think we have to, in our own little ways or big ways, wherever we are in the system, we need to think about who am I and what am I contributing to this co-creative future? How am I brave? How am I authentic? What does it mean for me? How can I seed the system with good ingredients? And then the final point I want to make is shifts can be surprising. I often hear people say, well, large change takes a long time. Well, it often doesn't. It kind of seems to come quite suddenly sometimes. I mean, look at the pandemic. 1 minute we didn't have one. The next minute, we've completely re-engineered the whole world. So shifts can be surprising. And sometimes even in the light of it looking hopeless, there's something about that a guy called Clive Hamilton, writing about Albert Camus' book The Plague, talks about active fatalism. Sometimes you have to despair, pull yourself together, and then act as if. And there's a thought to conjure with. So I'm going to stop there. Everybody's heaving a sigh of relief that I haven't talked for an hour and a half, and I'm going to hand over to Ian and Melanie and Amy to see if there are any questions. So thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Jean. That was absolutely wonderful. I got one little quote from your book that I really stuck to me beautifully. And it's right at the end when you said you've only got 2 days left to finish it off.
Yeah.
And you say here, the essential connectedness of everything means first that no one is safe until we are all safe. And second, I can't just sit back, drink another coffee and leave it all to them. So you didn't. You created a wonderful book. And thank you so much for explaining it to us today. It was absolutely wonderful. So at this point, I will try and get us all on the screen together. And hopefully that Melanie and Annie have got some questions that we can actually work with.
You can press end of slideshow.
End of slideshow. You can. Yep. Here we go. And I need to stop sharing the screen. That's the important thing.
Press escape.
There we go. Right. So we have 50 people online at the moment, and quite a few people in the room as well. So if you want to turn to speaker mode, you can see the room better that way. Otherwise, you can stay on gallery mode. And I'll hand over to Melanie and Amy to manage the questions that have come in through the chat, if that's okay. Thanks.
You see the people on the screen.
Perfect. Amy, you're going to take the first question, yeah?
Sure, yeah. So one question or two questions came from Richard, and I'll pick the first question, Richard, if that's okay. And I've rephrased it slightly so that it became a bit shorter. So of course, and Jane. So I don't know if Jane, you can see me, but I will continue.
I can see you. Yes,
Good.
yes. We're just fiddling with the camera.
We know that, to your point of diversity, right? We know that echo chambers play a big role on social media, And the question is, will that always lead to collapse? And I think also the question is, how would those catastrophic collapses then, kind of happen?
I'm not sure I've entirely understood the question, Annie. Sorry.
So to your point of, so I'm kind of reinterpreting the question. So to make it quicker. So you said there's diversity is a key point for a healthy system, right? Healthy ecosystem. And of course, we see a lot of echo chambers online in social media. And so the question is, will that always lead to a catastrophic kind of collapse of those bubbles? And if so, how would that happen?
Well, that's I don't know how to answer that question. I think that the echo chamber issue is an issue, isn't it? Because it does mean that people get very locked into their own views, and it sometimes can be very difficult to talk with people about differing views. We seem to be living in a variety of ways in a world where there's a polarization of views in all sorts of ways. So, if you look at some, say, US politics, where it's very polarized, it's like you're either this or you're that. It isn't. It isn't. We may not be able to do that, Ian.
No, we may not get the
you'll just have to not look at people. Yeah. They're wanting to see you in the room, but we can't get it to work. So I think polarization has become more normalized, and it's something that a woman called Chantal Mouffe, who's a French political writer, has talked about the need to create that kind of interconnectivity. She calls it agonistic dissent, and that we do need to kind of create in our communities and our societies and in our politics the ability to disagree, to share ideas, that being participative doesn't just mean we all have to agree. It's about how do we have real tussles with ideas, and that's kind of inculcated into our system. So it's true that that this kind of echo chamber ability makes that kind of that interconnectivity. We might have diversity, but we don't have interconnectiveness. So it makes the system more fragile. Now, so I guess that's what I would say to that. It's an increasing fragility.
Yeah,
thank you.
And actually also there was a question if we can see you rather than the room, because then we can see you answer the questions.
Yes, they want me. Yes,
that's better.
But I think Ian, they're not. I think people are still thinking online about questions. So maybe there are some questions in the room that you want to first go to, or we also, Mel and I have questions.
Questions in the room?
Well, Melanie, why don't you ask a question?
Sure. We just want to make sure that you haven't got any in the room that we're going to talk over. But if you're happy, I'm going to take a slightly different one here. We've got some quite challenging, deep questions. But I'm going to take one here from Hugh Atkinson that came in online. And it talks about the imbalance in the social system over the last 40 years is at a qualitatively different level than that previously seen, which I'm hearing, the family used to be, the social system used to be very solid and almost dependable and less volatile, shall we say. Why is this? And to link that family analogy, that many of the super rich are not even in a family. They're sort of self-centered loners. So I'm going to add a little bit to this, Hugh, if I may, to embellish the question. But if we use that family analogy, which I really like, can we adapt that to the family that we see now, the family of the sort of 21st century? Is that not more of a family that we used to have? I'm always very conscious that we do base a lot on history rather than on sort of now and futures. Just that concept really of family as a stable system, that system itself has changed a great deal.
Yes, I think let me just talk a little bit around that. You're asking blooming tricky questions, you lot.
Oh, they're trickier ones than that here, Jean. Trust me.
Yes, I know. So I think that if I talk about it societally, there seemed to be a step change, not in all societies. At the time of 1989, the idea of competition and selfishness being kind of, it's a bit like there was a kind of view that, well, people are selfish, but that's okay because competition will sort it all out, and then there'll be trickle down, and then it'll all balance and it'll be okay. So this kind of constituting as a norm, the idea that, good consumers are good citizens are good consumers, that selfishness is okay. In my experience, has been quite stark compared to a period that was, and I'm talking about what I know in terms of the UK, in terms of a post-war period where there was much more pulling together. That the setting up of the health system and education, up to the 1970s, it's the only period in UK history where there actually was upward mobility. It didn't happen before, it hasn't happened since. And there was a kind of pulling together of society in relation to a good family. And the way that's been constructed, and even if when you look at the kind of conversations, the kind of questions that the press ask, it's always about, well, how does this affect you? Have you got less? There's no kind of sense of kind of, the idea of other thinking about others and thinking about the world at large seems to have gone out of fashion. And I think that is pernicious. And it is coupled with a hugely rising inequality, both within countries and between countries. In terms of comments about how has the family changed, I don't know that I can answer that question. I mean, any of us could answer that question. So I'm probably not going to try and answer that particular aspect of it, but Melanie, maybe you have a view of that you'd like to share.
And I think the reality is that some of these questions we'd love to get deeply into, ideally with a bottle of wine or beer or something, and
yes,
explore, well, what caused those changes and what do we notice and what are the key moments of disruption in those systems, all those things. And we're not going to have time to do that here. I just agree with Amy to pull two questions together, which I'm going to give to you, which are they're slightly lighter, but they're also encouraging you to give us some tools to take away. So Mike from Wales, who is online, has put two comments on here, questions. The first one, this suggests he's an ex-RBP person. He says, Judy Marshall, Living Life as Inquiry, was fond of inviting us to hold things lightly. And I confess that's a phrase that I use a lot. And he asked, what do you like to invite people to do when you're talking to them about your journey or in reality, their journey? Because, we're looking at tools, we're looking at these models for our individual journeys along these ways. And Judy would say about holding things lightly. So his question is about what you invite to do. And I'm going to add his other part to that. So what would you invite people to do? And he asked what most commonly produces that aha moment when you're talking about life and science. Are there any patterns in the triggers that work best that you notice?
Yeah. Blimey, they are good questions. So in terms of holding things lightly, one of the things that I think is of concern in this whole field of complexity and systems thinking is a kind of a battle of the models and a battle of the views, and I think we have to hold that lightly, that we're all trying to say to the world at large, things are much more interconnected than you'd like to think. They're not as certain as you'd like to think. Things happen that you don't expect. How are we going to cope with that? And what my contribution to that is in a sense is this kind of bottom up kind of physicsy, biologically driven kind of worldview that starts with that kind of micro and then moves into, well, what kind of patternings do we see here? And then when it comes to intervening, then we might say sometimes, well, this situation is very chaotic, so our job here is to kind of cohere any shoots of change or any stability we can find and try and sort of support that. Or this situation seems to be very rigid, how do we actually intervene in such a way that we kind of destabilize even, or disrupt some of those stuck patterns? What method should we use? I'm talking ontologically as opposed to about methods, and I'm very well aware of all sorts of different methods, and I think they all have their uses, and some bits I like better than others, and some bits I think work better than others. But I want to be open and hold lightly this issue about who's right or wrong in this field, because it doesn't help us change the world. And I think I think people need us, and we have to kind of hold our ground, but be and create clarity. I mean, it's a paradox, it is, we want to create some clarity. It's not like anything goes, but I think it's important to hold this kind of lightly. And I think it's useful to think about, ontology, epistemology, and methodology, to use those words. I'm wanting to set a scene of what I think the world is like. How we then get to know about the world and intervene are different questions, and they'll have different answers in different circumstances. So I think that in terms of what it creates an aha moment for people. Now, I was doing something with a group in Athens last week of people from all over the world, and we were talking about big systems issues like this. We were talking about global issues, and about regime shift and climate change, and what do you do about things? And in the room, there's someone from Sri Lanka. They've just got a new government in. There's somebody from Georgia, wondering what the future holds. It was very real, to have people in that room discussing these things. And when I start people talking about these things and developing methods and ideas and mapping what's going on, there's a real sense of do we really believe this? This is all too difficult. What does she know anyway? Will this method work? There's a real kind of, and you're sort of, any of you that have facilitated anything, you stand there going, oh, beam me up, is this really going to work? Can I hold this? And then something happens, and the group start to get it, or they see something in what you're saying. And what creates that shift is something about how you hold yourself, isn't it? How I hold that, what I perceive, what kind of things I say to kind of bring out threads. And if I do it well, like all of you, it creates a shift and an aha moment. And I think the most important thing I feel in the end doing this kind of work is something about authenticity and being myself. Because this is a heart-mind issue, it's not just about ideas and so on. Changing things is the Chinese talk about Zen, the heart-mind. It's something that we hold deeply. I have to be prepared to be authentic and let myself be seen with the people that I'm working with. If there's something that sometimes I think it's about, when I think of people that change me, I went to visit, some of you will know Joanna Macy. I went and spent a week with her a couple of years ago, and it didn't really matter what she said. There was something about her, and this is a woman who works in, cares about things, works in sustainability, but her PhD was on the connection between Buddhism and social and systems thinking, back in the 90s. I mean, she's a remarkable woman. But what changed me and warmed me and confirmed me in my own position was who she is, her nature, how she listened to me and what she said. So I think there's something always, however highfalutin all this stuff sounds, it's actually somehow how you hold yourself in it that probably has more impact than anything. Let's see if there's anybody in the room here. Sarah, what would you like to ask?
Well, I've got a really big question, probably too big. So Taoism and So if Eugene were to design a, I don't know if you call it a religion or a spiritual guidance that would help us now, what's it need to look like? What are its characteristics? Christianity isn't serving, as far as I'm saying. I'm reading the Myths of Avalon at the moment, which is all about the battle between Christianity and the old ways back in the 6th, 7th century. What do we need? Who's our next Messiah? What do we need in terms of a spiritual input or model to bring us?
Oh, excellent. So I'm now designing a whole new religion in 5 minutes, so excellent. There's something, I think it's a really good question. I think there's something core to as you know, I'm very interested in Buddhism and Taoism, but it's true of all religions that there is something that core to it, which is about, caring, compassion, other-centeredness, and being brave and courageous in that, standing, I was about to go on a riff about Nelson Mandela, but I'll stop myself. But the core is something about, I'm not going to be saved. I'm not going to be forgiven. I'm going to play my part with others to create a sustainable future for the planet and our children. So there's something about me showing up and you showing up and us helping people to show up. What I like about Taoism and the kind of sorts of Buddhism that are very similar to Taoism, the Chan Buddhism, is that it does hold you in that position. It is about you. And there hasn't been time to talk about the Taoist worldview here, but it is not an overarching worldview. It isn't in the way that's a whole other, we could have a whole session on this. It's not avowing abstract overarching concepts such as heaven or even truth. It's always about the particular, the local. How do we move now here? How does the stream, how do we create the path that we're walking? So that's what I think, it's very easy to either blame somebody or think you'll be forgiven or think you're going somewhere else. Now, that I'm not, if that's people's views, I think that's fine. But if you ask me what I think is absolutely important to the future, it's like we've all got to show up and we've all got to collectively think about the future and each other and the planet and make it work. And if we don't, as we're not doing collectively, then we're in dire straits. So in some ways, we are all leaders, maybe, in how we hold ourselves and what we like Joanna Macy, she in some sense is somebody I would admire and look up to and would help me find my own strength and so on. My goodness, these are big questions. So I think it's 5 o'clock. I don't know how you're feeling. I think we should maybe take another couple of questions and maybe finish in 10 minutes or so. So anybody online or anybody in the room here who, you don't have to ask me about the whole of future of religion.
I still,
sorry. Sorry, I was going to say Ami's got a question for you.
No, so Jane, also related to some of the questions, or they were inspired by some of the questions online, but you early on talked about ontology, right? That you're very much about the ontology. And so yes. I thought maybe also asking the question, what do you think is missing in the today's ontology when it comes to, creating a more sustainable world? So just to give a bit more context, there's a lot of talk, right, about better ESG goals, even defining better purpose, according to the Sustainable Development Goals. So you could argue there's a lot of good work in that way. But if you could add anything to the sustainability agenda, what would it be?
I think that's a different question than, in my mind anyway. When I talk about ontology, I'm talking about the nature of reality, is there a reality, the nature of change, you know, those kind of questions. What is the world really like? So that's where I'm trying to express a view that if the world is complex, and complex isn't always a particularly useful word, because I mean, a lot of people say, well, you know, it's either complex, we've got to get rid of the complexity or manage the complexity or harness the complexity. But I'm trying to say just merely that things are interconnected in relational ways, and there's diversity. And then I'm theorizing about what does a complex situation, what do patternings look like? Why do I use the word patterning rather than system or structure or form? So, you know, if you look at sustainability then with some of these ideas in mind, you know, I haven't talked very much about the systemic nature of things, then, you know, we can't talk about sustainability without talking about economics. And we can't talk about economics without talking about the environment and resources and growth. So it's kind of joined up thinking that we need. And it's not difficult. I mean, it's not, you know, like it's not difficult. We do know that, you know, putting out more, you know, digging for more oil and coal is not like the best way to tackle a rising climate change that is not going away. It's about power, isn't it? It's about our economic structure. So I think in a way, what I would say is whatever your goal is, whether you're particularly driven by inequality or sustainability, and of course, complexity theory works just as well if you want to be as greedy as you can and win. You know, if you're a big company, it's not there's the science is value, you know, is apolitical, if you like. It will tell you, it will give you demonstrate how power leads to power. But if you're interested in developing a more sustainable and equal world, you can't do that without looking at the whole broad picture, at the social, economic, political, at the very big, at the very small, you know, and you have to go outside your sphere of influence. There's then the way I look at it, and is there are two parts to this. One of them is, how do you apprehend this big picture and start to see the vicious circles and the virtuous circles and the patternings that are in this whole big picture? But then how you act can be more particular. We don't have the same amounts of power. You know, we can't change some of these things easily. So there's a difference between how we apprehend it, the complex world, and then how we choose to act, which may sometimes be quite precise and particular. So I think there's something that Václav Havel talked about in The Power of the Powerless, which was, don't worry in this kind of, you know, if actually what's happening is that people just start to be themselves or do their own thing. You know, I've talked a bit in the book about, I borrow the phrase, let 100 flowers bloom. You know, sometimes it's okay. You don't always have to cohere everything or design it top down. You can just say, let's all do our bit and our best, and maybe we'll join up a bit sometimes, and maybe we won't, and maybe another opportunity will arise. I think we've got to find our own way, individually and collectively, into this agenda. And some of us at times will have more power and influence than others, and some of us will be in bigger positions of power than others. But you know, we've got to use, you know, it's what we do wisely. And, you know, I think I had a quote somewhere on one of my slides, which was, you know, evil often happens because good people do nothing, you know, so it's up to us, I think. So that's one more question, and then we'll
Jean, I've got a couple of really, really practical questions, which I hope are really going to be easy to answer. So give your brain a rest for 30 seconds. The first one is this recording going to be available to folks so that they can share it more widely?
Yes, if we manage to record it.
Okay, let's assume we have. But yeah, that's the first one. But I'm just going to put it out there that you might want to share some guidance on that when you send the recording out, about how we frame it and links to the book or whatever those things are. And then the second one was that there's a lot going on in the chat, and clearly we're not going to get to all of that. Some really complex questions, and also a lot of observations and so on, which I wouldn't want you to miss as much as anyone else. And I
Yes.
just want to make really sure that that's going to be captured so that you can see it and share as you see appropriate.
Yes.
So very mindful we're getting to the end of time, and so I was just going to propose finishing with one of those nice kind of what can we do questions, which is just thinking about this, really what you've been talking about there, about noticing how we act in our own space and putting out these, 1,000 different things and hoping that they build into, bigger change and a sort of collective movement, sort of trusting in the process a lot of the time, without a doubt. But I wonder, sometimes it's very easy to become overwhelmed by trying to notice what you can do, and that sense of whether it will or won't make any difference, and understanding your agency and power in that space. And I wonder if you have any pearls of wisdom, some guidance around how, either on an individual level or representing perhaps our organizations or tribes, how do we recognize what our opportunity is within that system at that moment, and how not to become overwhelmed by the complexity and the chaos sometimes around us?
Well, to just answer the practical question, we will try to send this out to people who've signed up via Marsha. If you didn't sign up via Marsha and you've just appeared, then you won't be on the list. So we will try and do that. I'm going to put it on my website, which is embracingcomplexity.com. So you can get it from there. With other stuff, and we'll probably share it on social media. And Ian,
Our newsletter,
and the Schumacher Institute, which you might like to join. Some of you, I recommend it. We'll also have it on the newsletter. In terms of the chat, if we're clever enough, and Ian and I are not very clever when it comes to all this, we will keep the chat and then work out what to do with it. So we might be able to share that. In terms of the question, I don't feel overwhelmed. I think do what you can, do your bit. Don't worry about it. You don't have to understand all the complexity. You have to work out what your values are and what you can do, and then do it. I'm also a bit of a used car salesman. I kind of creep into the interstices of things, and I seize opportunities, and I shoot my mouth off, and I get invited to things, and I sort of, that's what I do. But we're all different, and I think there's something about be yourself in this. Just what can you do? If you feel overwhelmed, find something that's worth doing and do it. You don't have to tackle all of it, but we have to keep moving forwards. And sometimes things will appear, and you'll think, oh, I can join in with that. I can help there, or I can set that off. I'm quite opportunistic. I don't, even writing this book was kind of, it followed the theory of the path is made by walking. The book kept emerging. I had a pretend set agenda because the publisher wanted me to have sections, and then I kept explaining why it had kind of morphed into something else. But it was a journey for me. That's my way. But I think I would really just say, work out who you are, what are your strengths and weaknesses, what are your networks, what can you do that you feel comfortable with, and do your bit. And that's all any of us do, I think. But show up, don't say, well, it's all too complicated, I'm not going to bother. That would be my advice. So on that happy note, yeah.
And the lovely thing about that, Jean, is that's the very simple kind of frontline message, and then you have so much behind all of that in the book, and all the reading that you do, and that you've introduced us to support all of that. So I'm out now. I'm going to back away and leave this to you guys to close out. Thank you very much.
Thank you. No, thank you, Mel and Amy. And and I'm not. That isn't in saying that. It's just I don't just wander around beaming at people in the street and picking up litter. That part of what I do is trying to teach these ideas and hold them and annoy people. That is part of what I do. But we're each of us different. But let me hand over to Ian to close it. Thank you. Yes.
Brilliant. That was actually brilliant, Jean. I'm reminded very much from the book that everything is a process. And this event today has been a process, and it's been a wonderful process indeed. And
Yes.
thank you very much for I would recommend the book to you all to get it. It is a process itself. It was a process to create it, but it would be a process to read it and a process to change yourselves. And that's what it's all about, isn't it, Jean?
Yes.
So I would like to say thank you very much indeed for an absolutely delightful talk.
Thank
and
you.
Good luck with everything.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very
Thank
much. Thank you for hosting. Well, we'll now try and switch this off and not lose everything in the process. I'm handing it over to Ian now. So, thank you, everybody.
It's another process. Thank you. Right. In the room, there's tea and coffee out there still, and please take the biscuits with you. On our budget, so.
You can't change
Just said in the book, there's a discount code on this piece of paper. So, just have a piece of paper.
reading for the book.
Yeah.